You may have read headlines or seen on social media recently just how sophisticated online fraud has become, particularly when it comes to romance scams. Lately, many are originating from large facilities overseas, often in office park dormitories that can house thousands of people, many of them victims of human trafficking.
Sadly, yes. So they'll be sitting somewhere in a compound with a script, being told what to say to you in order to get your money, but they don't have a choice.
That's Detective Constable Valerie Dahan from the Financial Crimes and Asset Forfeiture Unit at Toronto Police Service. She says romance scams, that is, someone pretending to be in love with you online and then luring you into parting with your money, are especially potent. Not just because of this whole industry that's cropped up, but because of how humans are naturally wired.
There's a true psychological effect that comes into romance scams and falling in love. So your brain function actually changes. You don't see that you're being deceived.
And modern-day fraudsters aren't just posing as potential suitors. They may even pretend to be from your bank.
Yeah, and we've seen an increase in bank impersonation scams across the industry as well.
That's McAllister, Vice President of Fraud Threat Management at Scotiabank. And he says scammers posing as your bank may even offer to come by your house to pick up your supposedly faulty or compromised bank card.
And so we've seen many cases where consumers provide their card to somebody at the front door, even so much as entering their PIN number.
October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, so Val and Aaron are our guests this episode to update us on the latest scams and tell us how to avoid falling victim. From the frauds we just mentioned to things like AI and even old-fashioned door-to-door grifts, they'll run down what to look out for and what to do if you suspect you, a loved one, or a neighbor might be a victim. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Aaron, Val, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you coming in.
Great to be here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Val, we're going to start with you. Can you tell me a bit about your role and maybe give us a bit of the lay of the land when it comes to scams these days?
So I'm a detective constable with the Toronto Police Service. I'm currently in the Financial Crimes Unit, and I'm in the Asset Forfeiture section. I'm also seconded to the Provincial Asset Forfeiture Unit, which is a joint force operation with the OPP. So when we're talking stats across the country for this calendar year, so January 1st, 2025 to, let's say, June 30th, 2025, by dollar loss, the most trending scam was an investment scam. So that could be any ranging investment scam. So that was a loss across the country of just shy of $127 million. Now, this statistic is from the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, right, and they are very clear to say that this is reported loss, and only about 5% of victims report their loss. And then the second one is romance scams, which is $26 million reported over the last 6 months. Now, again, that's just reported across the country, and instead of the 5% reporting trend that the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre sees, when it comes to romance scams, it's only 1%.
Wow. Okay, so we'll get into some of those specific types of scams later on. We'll delve into those a little bit more deeply. But Aaron, maybe you can tell us, just broadly speaking, what does the landscape look like for you?
Yeah, it's certainly a growing problem. We're seeing a lot of what Val described, right? So the most significant losses by dollar value are investment scams, for sure, as mentioned. We see a variety of different types of scams. The threat actors are very adaptable, so they'll also adapt based on what's happening in the media, what's observed, changes in the political landscape they'll try to take advantage of as well. We're also seeing a concerning rise in impersonation scams. So there's lots that's out there. The threat actors are also adapting with malicious use of AI and other types of technology, along with tactics that they've used for decades.
All right. As I said, we'll get into some of the specifics of all these different types of scams shortly. But Val, maybe you can give us some of the context around it. And we hear increasingly about some of these online scams in particular are being run. I mean, it's not just an individual doing it in their basement. There are crime rings, and this is a global phenomenon. Can you give us a little bit of the context around that?
Yes, absolutely. There's an interesting dynamic when it comes to who our bad actors are. If you're answering the phone and you identify the fact that there is a fraudster on the other end, you often have victims of human trafficking who are on the other end of the line, who are trying to detach you from your money. So they'll be sitting somewhere in a compound with a script, being told what to say to you in order to get your money, but they don't have a choice. They don't want to victimize you. They don't want to be involved in financial crimes or frauds, but it is what they have to do as a victim of human trafficking.
And that's a significant part of these operations, these types of essentially human trafficked people being forced to do these things. That's a large part of the problem.
Sadly, yes. I mean, I couldn't tell you what the percentage is,
Right.
but we also know that some people don't actually know what they're doing. They don't realize that what they're doing is illegal. They think, I applied to a job online. They said I had to make some calls and I had to do certain things, but they didn't realize what the impact was. And others are told, don't worry. Yes, you are committing fraud, but it's going to be fine because the money is insured. There's not a true victim on the other end of the line. They're going to get their money back. Really, you're getting the money from, the banks, the insurance company, whatever it is, but you're not creating persons as victims.
Right. I assume these sort of human trafficking operations, these are happening somewhere overseas.
Yes.
Okay.
They are very good at what they do. They can convince most people without alerting them to the fact that they are being victimized. So not to be taken lightly.
And I think that that's where collaboration is so important, right? We've seen that law enforcement has had success, but that's one part of the journey, the threat actor journey, as they're working to victimize folks. Often these discussions may start on social media or tech platforms. They may look to take their victim offline into a secure encrypted chat where some of these scripts are executed. We're seeing more and more that these types of frauds and scams are part of the multinational organized crime that Val described. They'll use components from other criminal groups like phishing as a service kits to lure people in, other services to spoof their phone numbers, to contact their victims. There's a whole marketplace out there that's used in this effort to, as Val put it, detach people from their money.
Right.
As we're talking about the ecosystem around fraud and scams and the involvement across social media, messaging platforms, financial institutions, it's really important to remember that we've all got a role to play in identifying and preventing fraud.
Right. So, you've both spoken about sort of the increasing sophistication of these operations, whether they're domestic or somewhere overseas. Banks and the police are doing everything they can to try and prevent these things from happening. But it must be incredibly hard, Aaron.
Yeah, there's been some examples of success, right, with banks and law enforcement working together. Also, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre has published information where they've had success working multinationally to recover, millions for victims. So there can be success in those cases, although it's challenging as the frauds are increasingly sophisticated, as they involve several hops often of money movement between financial institutions, potentially domestically, then internationally, sometimes to crypto exchanges as well.
Right.
And so identifying what's occurring early, prevention, of course, is key, but identifying what's occurring early and engaging with the financial institution and law enforcement is important.
Let's talk about some of the specific scams, and you mentioned a couple of them, but we'll go through some of these in a little bit more detail. Aaron, let's start with impersonation scams, which is basically when someone pretends to be someone else in order to separate them from their money, as you both have talked about. We've heard about grandparent scams on the show before, where people use technology to impersonate a grandchild and ask for money, sort of preying on the affections of grandparents. But one that we're hearing a lot about now is bank impersonation scams, which you would be very familiar with. Why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, and we've seen an increase in bank impersonation scams across the industry as well. These are characterized by receiving contact from somebody claiming to be at the bank, either a bank investigator, a fraud department, even in some cases, an investment advisor. In the bank investigator scams, they're reaching out saying that there's been fraud on the account or fraudulent activity in relation to the account. They need the would-be victim to verify certain information, and then to help them address that claim or issue, they need to conduct some verification. And so that's when they'll go into trying to capture sensitive personal information like PIN numbers, passwords, one-time codes. So that should be a big red flag if somebody's receiving a call claiming to be from the bank and asking for sensitive personal information or those types of validation credentials.
Okay. We'll get into a little bit of what a bank maybe wouldn't ask you to do, but I've also heard about some of these fraudsters saying they're going to send someone to your house to pick up your credit card or whatever.
Yes, yeah, the frauds have evolved, and one of the evolutions of that bank investigator scam is saying that cards you have now aren't secure. And to make sure that we can secure your account going forward, they'll provide specific instructions sometimes even on how to cut up the card in a way that the card is still usable, and suggest that they'll send a courier or a representative of the bank to their home, to their front door to pick up their card. And then they'll follow through with that. And so we've seen many cases where consumers provide their card to somebody at the front door, even so much as entering their PIN number as well into a phone system that they believe to be the bank's, but is the person who's called them, telling them that they're going to transfer them to an IVR to enter their PIN number securely. This is on a call, again, that they've received that they weren't expecting, indicating that there was a problem with their account. The bank will never send someone to your door to pick up your cards or ask for that type of sensitive information on a call you didn't initiate. The bank may ask to verify if a transaction is yours or not, and so there's a similarity there. The bank will not ask you to provide an OTP number that you receive. The bank will not ask you to provide your digital banking credentials. The bank won't ask you to provide the PIN number for your payment cards. These are things that should be red flags to anybody if they receive a call claiming to be from their financial institution. And as mentioned, the bank will definitely not send someone to your door to pick up your cards.
Right. And OTP is one-time passcode?
That's right, a one-time passcode. So you may be used to receiving those one-time passcodes for verifying e-commerce transactions that you conduct online, or as part of multi-factor authentication, logging into your banking account or other types of accounts. And financial institutions may even ask for a one-time password on a call that you make to the bank, but never on a call that you receive from them.
Okay. Increasingly, we hear about AI being used in these impersonation scams, I guess particularly with the grandparent scam. Can you just explain that briefly? We have gone over it before in some episodes, but I think it's worth just mentioning briefly. And how do you avoid falling for something like that? Like, should you have like a family password or something that would help you detect someone who wouldn't know that?
Yeah, so two parts to that. Maybe I'll talk about the AI component for a second and then get into the grandparent scam. So there's actually several AI companies and well-known social media companies that have put out reports themselves in the last year that detail how their platforms or services have been abused for the purpose of financial crime and scams, as well as other criminal activity. And so it's very clear that these types of technologies and platforms are being abused for the purpose of scams and fraud. And so it's that much more important to be vigilant in responding to it, and having awareness of that is sort of the first step. Specific to the grandparent scam, this is where somebody receives a call, as the name implies, often purporting to be a grandchild, claiming to be in trouble. So there can be a variety of lures or situations that are described there, but it's always a family member in trouble, and then often leading to, I need funds, I need money for bail, I need money in relation to a car accident, and, I've got to give someone funds because I don't have the right insurance. There's many different lures there. It all centers around a claim to be a known family member calling and in trouble and need of funds. Right. You mentioned a code word. That can be a useful thing to establish ahead of time and to discuss within the family to say, if there's ever a circumstance where I need help of some kind, here's the code word that we'll all agree upon ahead of time to provide some level of assurance that it is indeed the family member that you're contacting.
Okay. Valerie, I wanted to ask you about romance scams, which we've heard a lot about, but maybe you can give us a brief explanation of what those are and how common they are.
So romance scams are extremely common. So a romance scam is where a bad actor is going to feign romantic interest in their victim and shower them with attention so that the victim will at some point fall in love and become a victim of this romance scam where, it doesn't start off as 150% right off the hop. There's going to be some courting, conversation, texting. And as time passes, and even in a short period of time, with so much attention that they've provided to this victim, the victim will now feel this real connection with a bad actor. And conversation will build into, things are all of a sudden a little bit off for the bad actor, whether their child has an emergency and they need some funds or they need some assistance. They're working on an oil rig and they don't have access to the money, and maybe their new love interest can help them out by sending the money to someone else because they don't have access to Wi-Fi. There's a number of layers that are added to the scam so that the victim is falling in love. And secondly, They don't see what the problem is. What's interesting when it comes to romance scam, and I've investigated them in the past, and I've dealt with the victims in the past. There's this quote from Mark Twain where it says, it's easier to fool someone than convince them that they've been fooled. When it comes to romance scams, that is actually very accurate. You will speak to your victim. You will try to show them that this person is not who they're purporting to be. Look at the photo that they sent you. It is obviously photoshopped and could be a very poor Photoshop job as well. But no, this is the person I've fallen in love with, and he's in love with me. So you can try to convince them all day that they're a victim and that the other person, A, doesn't exist, or they do exist, but they're not the person that they say they are. So there are layers to romance scams. And what's interesting, and I think it's interesting for family members to understand and for friends to understand, is there's a true psychological effect that comes into romance scams and falling in love. There's an anthropologist by the name of Helen Fisher, who was out of Rutgers, who conducted experiments when it came to the science of love. She got a group of 100 participants of people who had fallen in love at the peak of being in love and conducted functional MRIs on these participants. And what they could see from the MRIs is that the brain actually changes when you fall in love. And I'm talking madly in love. Your brain will change. It will change your ability to understand that you're being fooled. You can't pick up on the things that you would if you're just level-headed. So your brain function actually changes. You don't see that you're being deceived. So when you're a victim of a romance scam, there is an actual science to it. And you have to remember that this bad actor, this is their full-time job. They have X amount of people who they're courting, right? Victimizing at the same time. And they are showering them with attention. So it's pretty easy for a person to believe that they're not a victim and they're actually in a romantic relationship with someone.
So how would you even warn people against something like that? But you also mentioned maybe their friends or family members might be noticing something's going on as well. Like, what are the red flags? How do you avoid getting caught up in something like that?
So if you were to think back to how you've ever dated in the past, the ultimate goal would be to meet the person pretty quickly in person and go from there. Yeah. But when you're involved in a romance scam, which is usually virtual, whether it's by phone or on a computer, the bad actor is trying to, as much as possible, avoid meeting in person. And they will continue that for as long as possible. So if you see that the person that you're communicating with isn't interested in meeting you,
right,
then that's a red flag. If really quickly they've declared their love for you, that's a red flag. If the person quickly is in a scenario where they need money from you, that's a red flag. There is time to pause. There is time to think when it comes to those scenarios. As much as I've described that your brain has changed if you're madly in love and you won't recognize these red flags, there is the opportunity. I think if the person were to step back just a touch and look at those red flags, they might see it. Some people don't want to see it. And I've had many coworkers who have reached out and said, my family member, I believe, is a victim of a romance scam. And then when they've approached their parent and said, listen, I think you're a victim, they absolutely refuse to believe it. So it doesn't really matter who it's coming from. Sometimes it's an uphill battle just to get them to recognize it.
And I guess for a lot of people, if they are taken advantage of in this way, they're going to be really embarrassed about it, and maybe they're going to be reluctant to tell anybody, but it's still important to report it, right?
Yeah, correct. It's very important to report it. On our standpoint, when it comes to our intakes and tracking the trends and scams that are happening within our city and throughout the country, it is very important for us to know what kind of frauds are happening.
Well, you mentioned that taking the time to pause and think. I guess that applies to a lot of the things that we're talking about, even talking about the impersonation scams, Aaron, before. They always try and create a sense of urgency. Something needs to happen really quickly, which creates this sort of panic in a person, maybe do things they wouldn't necessarily want to, when really they should just say, I'm going to call the number on the back of my card, right?
Yes.
At least for that type of scam.
Yeah, that presenting a sense of urgency is common across many types of scams. And so the advice that Val has is so important. Just pausing, taking that time to reflect, contacting a family member or somebody you trust to say, hey, here's the scenario that I'm being presented with. Does this sound right? Does this feel right? We hear from customers that that's often how scams can be detected too, is they've shared what just occurred with a family member or friend who said, that's not right. We've even heard stories where people say, that's not right. Like here, Scotiabank's page, scotiabank.com/security says this won't happen this way, or this is a red flag. And so taking that moment to pause and reflect is important across many types of the scams that we're describing that are often remote. It applies to other scams that might occur in person, like door-to-door sales scams.
Okay. And maybe this next category of scam that we're going to talk about falls into that. But we hear increasingly about home improvement scams. Val, can you explain what those are and what to be on the lookout for?
Those are common. They aren't slowing down, and they will continue on. Doesn't matter what season we're in. Mm-hmm. The layout would be somebody comes to your door and explains that they're a contractor. Based on looking at your house, they could see there's a slope in your roof that shouldn't be there. There's a crack in your foundation that they can see that shouldn't be there. And then the fraud goes from there. There are different variations to it where the contractor will come and do none of the work. If they do none of the work after a down payment, that's obviously going to be reported to police. So those are absolutely evolving. We had the roofing scams last year, but sometimes it's the foundation scam, and the person won't recognize it. I'm not personally a handy person. If you tell me that there's something wrong with my roof, I might believe you. Now, what will I do after that? Will I take your name? If you don't have an online presence, that's probably going to be a red flag for me. Right? If you do have an online presence, what kind of reviews do you have? So again, like Aaron discussed, the sense of urgency when they come and quickly, the foundation is breaking. We have to work right now. Right. I think there is always time to stop, pause, and look at the situation, like Aaron suggested. Talk to a trusted friend. I'd actually like to implement something like WWVAD, which is what would Val and Aaron do? There's a ton of different scams out there that you have the opportunity to pause and look. So, for example, maybe I get a text message saying my Amazon account is being suspended. There's a link there. I might want to click the link to see what they're talking about, but then maybe I'll take a step back and say, let me just go right to the app. There's always a method to verify that information.
Yeah, and certainly if you've clicked a link, if you think you've been victimized, even if you've just received content you're not sure, you can call your bank at the number on the back of your card. It's important not to trust the call just because the caller ID claims that it's from a bank or a government institution or law enforcement. Those phone numbers can be spoofed. So if you've received a call and you're not sure, or if you've clicked a link, call the number on the back of your card for your financial institution.
Okay. And in some of these scams that you talked about, the home improvement scam, certainly a grandparent scam would be targeting seniors in particular. Aaron, in your experience, are seniors more often targeted or more vulnerable?
I would say that there's different types of scams and fraud that target different people. And so I wouldn't suggest that seniors are more vulnerable necessarily, but that certainly they're targeted for different types of scams in some cases, and they may be taken advantage of or attempted to be taken advantage of in opportunistic ways as well.
Okay.
Scotiabank also adheres to the Seniors Code. So the Seniors Code is a set of principles that helps ensure that older adults have additional protection, clear information, and some additional guidance as they're navigating the banking system.
Okay. Aaron, as we wrap up here, we've heard a bunch of good tips overall on a bunch of these scams. Broadly speaking, any final tips about how people can protect themselves? I've heard of something called cyber hygiene. What does that mean, and how does that fit into sort of a protection plan?
Yeah, cyber hygiene is important. We've talked a lot about some of the social engineering aspects and how to be aware of that so you can prevent it. Cyber fraud hygiene is important. Things like making sure that you're using multi-factor authentication wherever it exists, both from your banking services, but also from your email or social media platforms to protect your accounts and reduce the likelihood that you can be compromised. Keeping your devices up to date. So there's those sometimes seemingly pesky software updates for your iOS device or Android or your computer, but completing those software updates is important because they often contain security fixes as well. Choosing strong passwords and not using the same password on your banking site that you might use on a movie review site. Strong, unique passwords is important. And being aware of what's occurring and what some of these risks are. Val mentioned all the information that's available through the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre. There's additional information available as well at scotiabank.com/security, containing details about different types of scams and fraud. And certainly Scotiabank participates quite actively in various public campaigns to help promote that awareness as well. Like March is Fraud Prevention Month. We participate actively there. October, of course, is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We participate there. Certainly we'll have additional content that we're publishing online to our customers and through different social media channels and platforms. And we've got a lot of content that we put out throughout the year as well. So we've got an always on campaign. And some of the best prevention can be making sure that, as you're hearing this, that you're sharing with a loved one as well about the scams that you've heard or the tips that you've heard, sharing with a friend or family member, so that if they encounter some of these red flags, they can say, wait a second, I heard about this before. I know to watch out for it.
Okay. And Val, as we wrap up here, what do you want people to take away from this conversation?
So completely agree with Aaron that resources are available as well. We have tps.ca, that's Toronto Police website. But as much as I'm representing Toronto Police and Toronto as a whole, this is not just for Toronto residents. So one thing that I would say is, if you are unsure and you have a question mark, you can't always reach your relative. A police officer is always available to help. We would much rather spend the time on the phone with you if you're unsure of whether you're being potentially victimized. We'd rather spend time doing that than spending the time investigating your occurrence once you've been victimized.
Right.
The non-emergency number is always available and there's always a police officer working. So please, sometimes it just takes a quick 2-second conversation. The police officer on the end of the line will say, nope, that's a scam. So take a moment, pause, think, and verify by the way that we're saying. Call someone.
So take your time.
Take your time. Yeah.
Aaron, Val, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation.
Thanks. Really enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Aaron McAllister, Vice President of Fraud Threat Management at Scotiabank, and Detective Constable Valerie Dahan from the Financial Crimes and Asset Forfeiture Unit at Toronto Police Service. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.